Did you know that a few decades ago, a guy named Alan Bake was denied entry to medical school? Not once, but twice. He was qualified and everything, but he ended up suing, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, talk about a landmark case, right?
Total landmark case. It set off this huge debate about fairness and opportunity, and that's where affirmative action comes in. And let me tell you, this topic is way more complicated and fascinating than you might think.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just black and white, that's for sure.
So today we're going deep beyond the headlines to really unpack affirmative action. How does it actually work? Where did it even come from? And what does the data say about its impact? And we've got some seriously credible sources to guide us.
We're talking the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to get the history and the big ideas, then a data-heavy analysis from Holzer and Neumark's 2005 paper, Affirmative Action. What do we know?
And if that wasn't enough, we're also diving into a super recent study from 2024 by Antman, Duncan, and Levenheim. They looked at what happens when you actually ban affirmative action. Spoiler alert, it's complicated.
To say the least.
So one of the things that blew my mind prepping for this, affirmative action, it didn't start with colleges at all.
Nope, not even close.
It started with workplaces. Like we're talking factories, firehouses, the works.
Right, it's the 1960s, huge social changes happening, and then bam, Lyndon B. Johnson signs Executive Order 11-1246 in 1965. It was about federal contractors, big companies, and they suddenly had to diversify. Big time.
Wow, so the government basically stepped in and said, okay, enough is enough, time to make a change. That's a huge deal. But how do we go from factories to universities in just a few years?
Well, in the 70s, people started thinking, hey, if it works for jobs, why not education? Everyone deserves a fair shot at higher education, right?
Yeah.
And that's where our buddy Alan Bake comes in. Remember him?
Oh, yeah, Bake. His case in 1978, Regents of the University of California v. Bake, is legendary. The Stanford Encyclopedia goes deep on this, and it's a wild ride. Okay, so Bake applies to med school, decent scores, gets rejected twice. Then he finds out that minority students with lower scores got in through a special program. He's furious, claims reverse discrimination, and bam, lawsuit.
And the Supreme Court's decision had everyone on the edge of their seats. It was a split decision. They said straight-up quotas were a no-go, unconstitutional. But, and this is huge, they said, considering race as one factor among many in admissions was okay. It's where we get that narrowly tailored concept.
Okay, so using race is okay, but only in a narrowly tailored way. What does that even mean in real life?
That's the million-dollar question. That's what made this ruling so important, but also so debated. It basically left it up for interpretation.
So basically, they open this Pandora's box, and everyone's trying to figure out what fits in it.
Pretty much. This one case fueled decades of debates and lawsuits, with people arguing over what exactly counted as narrowly tailored enough to be legal.
It's insane how one case can have such a ripple effect. But you know what I'm curious about? What happened to Pack? Did he ever become a doctor?
He did, actually. Bake eventually got into med school and became an anesthesiologist.
Wow, talk about adding another layer to this whole thing. I mean, if Bake eventually achieved his goal, does that change how we view affirmative action, at least in his case? Or even more broadly?
It definitely makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We're talking about individual stories versus larger systemic impacts. It's complicated. It really does make you think, doesn't it?
Right.
Like on one hand, you have Bake reaching his goal, but then you have to think about the bigger picture, the systemic stuff. It's not just about one guy, right?
Exactly. We need to look at the bigger picture. And you know what helps with that? Hard data. That's where Holzer and Neumark's 2005 paper comes in. Affirmative action. What do we know? They crunched decades of data to see how affirmative action really plays out.
And one of the things they found that I thought was really interesting was that, yeah, affirmative action does shake things up a bit. It leads to some redistribution of opportunities, like who gets hired or admitted.
Yeah.
But
Here it comes.
yeah, here it comes. The magnitude of that shift, it's often blown out of proportion in the public eye.
So it's not like this massive wave of white men losing jobs left and right.
Right. It's not some crazy zero-sum game. It's more nuanced than that. And get this, they actually found that companies using affirmative action often had more strict hiring processes, not less. Surprising, huh?
Wait, really? I would have thought it was the other way around. Why would they make it harder?
Well, think about it. If a company's actively trying to diversify, they're going to be extra careful to make sure they're hiring truly qualified people from all backgrounds, right? They don't want to lower their standards. They want to make sure they're raising the bar for everyone.
Makes sense. They want to make sure that when they're diversifying, they're not sacrificing quality. They're expanding the pool of talent, not lowering the bar.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about expanding the pool and making sure everyone in that pool gets a fair shot. And you know what else is interesting? The paper didn't just look at hiring, they also dove into employee performance.
Oh, so did it actually impact how well people did at their jobs?
Exactly. They wanted to know, did those hired through affirmative action perform any differently? And the results were kind of all over the place. It really challenged that stereotype, that people hired through affirmative action somehow perform worse. Often there just wasn't a big difference.
It's amazing how data can really challenge our perceptions. This isn't just some theoretical debate. This is people's lives we're talking about, their careers, their families, everything. To everyone listening, I think it's worth asking ourselves, how does this change the way we think about affirmative action? Who does it really help and how?
Couldn't agree more. These are real people, real lives affected by these policies. And while this data is super important, there's still a lot of debate, especially about this idea of the mismatch effect.
Ah, yes, the mismatch debate. This is where things get really interesting and heated. So, this mismatch idea, it's kind of like saying sometimes affirmative action might backfire, right? Like it'll
Well,
put people in situations where they're just out of their depth.
yeah, exactly. Think about it like being thrown into the Olympics, say, gymnastics, before you even know how to do a cartwheel.
Oof. Yeah, you're going to have a bad time.
Exactly. You're set up for failure, basically. And it's the same idea here. Like you get into this top-tier school, which is amazing, congrats, but then you get there and everyone else is just operating on a whole other level.
Right. And you're playing catch up the whole time, maybe even starting to doubt if you belong there. Maybe you would have been better off at a school that was still a good fit, but not such a huge leap.
Hmm.
So you could actually, thrive, not just survive.
Right, where you could actually shine, instead of feeling lost in the crowd. That's the whole mismatch argument.
Yeah, I get it. It makes sense on some level. But then there's the whole other side of the coin. Like maybe being in that more demanding environment pushes you to rise to the occasion, even if it's rough at first.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
like, yeah, you're surrounded by these brilliant minds, these amazing resources, and even if you stumble, you're still learning and growing at an accelerated pace.
Okay. You come out the other side with the skills and the network to take on the world. So how do we even begin to weigh these two sides? Well, this is where that 2024 paper by Antman, Duncan, and Lovenheim comes in clutch. They looked at those states, remember?
What?
Where they banned affirmative action, Texas, California, Washington, and Florida.
And the really cool thing is they didn't just stop at the immediate aftermath. They used census data and stuff like the American Community Survey to track what happened long term. Did these bans actually help or hurt underrepresented minorities? Did they graduate at higher rates? Did they earn more money? Did they end up in different kinds of jobs? Fascinating stuff.
So spill the tea. What'd they find? Level playing field or total disaster?
Well, it's not so cut and dry, which, let's be honest, is usually the case with this topic, right? But the really interesting thing is how different the impact was for men and women.
Ooh, okay. Tell me more about these gender differences.
So for women, especially Hispanic women, getting rid of affirmative action actually correlated with fewer of them finishing college. And get this, lower earnings down the line.
Really?
Yeah. It kind of suggests that for them, going to those more selective schools, even if it was tough, actually paid off in the long run. That those credentials, those experiences, opened doors that might have stayed closed otherwise.
So for them, it's almost like that mismatch idea wasn't really the deciding factor. It was more about the opportunities that came with going to a top school, even if it was a tougher road.
Exactly. But, and you knew there was a but coming, right? The results for men, way less clear-cut.
Oh man, why does it always have to be so complicated? So are we saying mismatch is a real concern for men, but not so much for women?
Not so fast. It's more like this research shows us that one size doesn't fit all. The impact of affirmative action and whether mismatch even plays a role depends on a whole bunch of things. We're talking gender, race, what someone's background is like, the specific schools involved, probably a ton of other factors we haven't even thought of.
Okay, so no easy answers then.
Definitely no easy answers.
That's kind of the beauty of these deep dives, though, isn't it? We get to dig into the nuance, challenge those simple narratives we always hear.
Absolutely. It's about asking the tough questions, looking at things from all angles. And speaking of tough questions, remember the Supreme Court's recent decision on race-based admissions? Big changes happening there.
Huge changes.
So, knowing everything we've talked about today, what do you think? How will this decision impact access to education and even the workplace down the line? And what does it mean for diversity in those spaces?
It's a lot to unpack, right? But that's the thing about knowledge. It doesn't always give us easy answers. Often it just leads to more questions. But that's okay. That's good. That's how we learn and grow, right?
100%.
So to everyone listening, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into affirmative action. We just scratched the surface, but hopefully we've piqued your curiosity and given you some food for thought. Don't stop here. Check out those source materials we talked about. Share what you learned with a friend. This is how we make sense of the world, how we challenge our own biases, and how we move towards a better future.
Couldn't have said it better myself.